One of the best things about the online knitting community is the wealth of information available about every single different type of knitting. You can learn new techniques, you can troubleshoot issues, you can just get little tips and tricks that'll help you along your way to make your knitting better and to make it a more enjoyable experience for you. But the flip side of that coin is that there is a huge amount of information online, and it's really difficult to sort of sort through it and sort out what is the essential facts and what is people's opinion. And sometimes I think the effect of that information overload is that it just puts people off from trying, and it just makes simple things seem a lot more complex than they really are. And that's something that I'm massively passionate about. I really think anybody can knit anything. It's just about having that patience with yourself, that self-belief, and that you can do it. So I've been knitting for 4.5 years now, and I would say I'm a pretty good knitter. For now, I'm not saying I'm an expert knitter, but I'm a pretty good knitter. Over the years, I've picked up a few rules of knitting that people band around that I personally have ignored. And therefore, based on the fact that I've been knitting for a while and I knit quite a range of different things, I feel like you can ignore as well. Now, I do want to say, these are all things that I'm not actively saying that you shouldn't do these things if you want to do these things. They all have their benefit. There's a reason why people do them. But if you're starting out, or you're learning a new technique, or you're just a bit like me and you're a little bit impatient to get to the end of a project, and people are saying you must do it this way, let me be the one to tell you that you don't. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So the first rule of knitting that I don't agree with is that you must use lifelines. Now, what are lifelines? Lifelines are pieces of yarn that are threaded into your knit projects at various points. And the purpose of them is so if you need to rip your project back to a certain point, say you make a mistake or something like that, you want to rip it back to a certain point, there is a safe line to do so, a lifeline. So that means that you're not going to risk losing your stitches. It just quite easily takes it back to that point. There's obviously benefits to having lifelines. You can safely rip back your stitches if you're doing a complex piece, say you're doing colour work or you're doing lace work or cables or even just a stockinette piece. The yarn might be slippy, you might not want to lose your stitches. There is a benefit to having that lifeline in there. That said, I have been knitting for 4.5 years and I have never once used a lifeline. I've constantly had to rip back my knitting, but it's never ever been an issue for me that I actually really wanted to have a lifeline there. While I can massively see its benefit, it's not something that I've done and it's not something that I will be doing. So take from that what you will. I will say, I think if you are someone who knits a lot of lace, say you're knitting a lot of complex lace, then I can see the benefit of having a lifeline in there, because obviously I think when you've got a complex lace pattern with yarn overs and such, then it does make sense to maybe have one in there. But at the same time, I'm currently doing a lace project and there is no lifelines in there, and neither will there be. So it's a matter for you, of course, but I would say if you're stressing about lifelines, don't. No need. So number 2 is taking account of colour dominance in your stranded colourwork knitting. Colour dominance is when you're knitting with 2 colours in stranded colourwork, and the idea is that you have a dominant colour and you've got a background colour. Got to make sure that you've correctly picked the right dominant colour and the right background colour, because if you get them the wrong way round, the work will not give the impact that you're looking for. And it does make a difference. I've seen on Reddit people say, oh, it's a myth. And it's definitely not a myth. Like, it is definitely true. If your tension is different in your colours, then obviously, yes, one colour is going to appear a bit diminished compared with the other colour, and that might be the impact that you want. That might not be the impact that you want, and that's something that you want to keep in mind. I think it's especially relevant when you're knitting two-handed with colourwork, which I don't do, can't do. People always say, oh, you should try it. I'm like, I probably won't. That's basically where, you know, in one hand you're knitting English and in the other hand you're knitting continental, and then you're knitting your piece that way. And in that way, obviously, because you've got 2 separate hands knitting using different knitting techniques, probably will be a difference between the dominant colour and the background colour. And in those cases, yes, you want to have a real think about colour dominance. However, if you're like me, I mean, I'm an English knitter and I will just knit them from the same hand, you know what I mean? And I just keep my tension really neutral throughout. This has never come up for me. This has never ever been an issue for me. And I've knitted a lot of stranded colourwork. Maybe this is risky to say because maybe this is tempting people to go back and have a look at my old colourwork and be like, well, actually the colour dominance is pretty poor on this one. But like, really, it's never something that's ever come up for me. It's never ever been an issue. But it's one of these things, colour dominance is something that I see like on the forefront. And I see this on, you know, TikTok and on Reddit. People will be like, I'm starting out in colourwork, I'm thinking about colour dominance. Forget it. Like, why? Why are you thinking about colour dominance? Just like leave it alone. Like, maybe that's a perfecting tip for the future when you're really good at it. As I said again, if you use a different technique of colourwork than me, then maybe it is really important from the get-go. But for a lot of us, especially if you're starting out, it's just not really that relevant. And I just see it being put as some really important thing. You must think about colour dominance. And I personally never think about colour dominance, and I don't think you need to either. Okay, number 3, and this one's going to get me in trouble. I can feel it. I don't always gauge swatch. I have said this online before, so this shouldn't come as a shock to anybody, but I can imagine some people will immediately hit that unfollow button because this is considered a sin in many knitting communities. What is gauge swatching? Gauge swatching is when before you start your knitting project, you will use the needles that you're planning to make the project with and the yarn you're planning to make the project with, and you will knit a little sample square. And the purpose of this is that once you've knitted your little sample square, you can then measure it and see if it matches gauge according to what the pattern says. So for example, the pattern might say the gauge is 18 stitches over 21 rows in a 10 by 10 centimetre square. So then what you do is you might knit up a 10 by 10 centimetre square, you might knit it a bit bigger, but then you measure out in that whether within a 10 by 10 centimetre square you will have 18 stitches and 21 rows. And if you do, great, you've matched gauge. Hallelujah. And if it's off, then you'll adjust the needles that you use. So that's the point of gauge swatching, and it is lauded as one of the most important parts of any knit project. You must gauge swatch. And there is a lot of compelling reasons to gauge swatch, definitely. And I've definitely had some really ill-fitting projects that I didn't gauge swatch. Probably because I didn't gauge swatch them, possibly. Probably. I say probably, I just really mean possibly. However, I don't think it's necessary to gauge swatch every project, and let me tell you why. So there's some occasions where I don't even think it makes sense to gauge swatch. So for example, if you're using a yarn that you're familiar with, and say you're knitting in a weight that you often knit in, so Aran, for example, I like to knit in Aran, sometimes you already have an idea of how it's going to fit. You don't really need to do the gauge swatch because you already know. And I think that sort of happens. The more you knit, the more you've used different yarns and you've used different needle sizes and you've worked in projects before, so you have an idea of, right, well, I cast on that many and that fits like this, so maybe I want less or more or whatever. And it gets to a point where you can make an educated guess of how things are going to work. And you could spend your time gauge swatching, but if you're impatient like me, you just want to get on with it. And another point as well is often, for me at least, I'm not massively invested in how it fits. Sometimes you're making things that are oversized or they're really not that fitted and you don't really have that massive investment as to how well it's going to fit. So unless you're using a super out there yarn or it's weights of yarn that you're super unfamiliar with, then you kind of just think, well, let the chips fall where they may. Obviously there's a margin. It's not going to necessarily be bang on the measurements provided by the pattern, but that's probably okay. I know this is probably short-sighted thinking because you think actually it would have taken you however long to do a gauge watch, but sometimes you just physically can't. And listen, I'm not the only one who really struggles with having the attention span to do a gauge watch, because whenever I spoke about it live, people are like, me neither. I also barely gauge watch. So that's all I'm saying. And the final thing that I would like to say about gauge watching is it actually doesn't always work. When you gauge watch, you do a little sample and then obviously you block it out and then you can be like, right, so this is what it looks like and this is how many stitches are in it. But the thing is, if you're making, for example, a heavy knit, actually the weight of that knit is going to pull it further than would be demonstrated by your sample. So if your sample's this big, right, there's no weight to it, so it's just right, it blocks out like that. But if you make a long cardigan, a long heavy cardigan, I've done this with a chunky cardigan before, when actually I finished it, the weight of the bottom was so heavy that it was dragging it down anyway, but a gauge swatch wouldn't have shown me that. So it's kind of sometimes it works, sometimes there's real benefit to gauge swatching, but sometimes it's not always the magic answer that people laud it as. As I say, if you are a gauge swatcher, then good for you, and I admire you. In some ways, I wish I was more like you, but if you're not a gauge swatcher and that's just not how you roll, don't worry about it because it's really not that deep. Okay, and the final rule that I disagree with is that you should always go back and fix your mistakes. Now, obviously it depends what kind of mistakes we're talking about, but generally speaking, if I'm doing a bit of colour work, a bit of lace work, a bit of cables, and I make a mistake, unless it's literally the row before, and even then sometimes not, I just let it lie. So the colour work, you could obviously fix it with duplicate stitch afterwards. You can do a little bit of that with the cables and the lace as well. But many times I have made mistakes in my knitting that I realised too late, and then I've been looking at it and being like, oh God, I'm so annoyed I made this mistake. And then a year later, I couldn't even point out where the mistake is. It just becomes part of the knitted item and it really, really doesn't matter. So I think minor mistakes like that, some people really love to go back and fix them and really think that you should, and you should do it all properly. But I just think life is short. Do you know what I mean? What, you're going to waste more time ripping back to do a tiny mistake, and then it's just not how I roll. I will say though, there are some occasions where I do have to go back, and a classic example of this is the other day I was knitting the arm of a jumper that I'm making, and I realised halfway through the sleeve that I hadn't been doing any decreases for the arm whatsoever. I could have started that out and just had quite a puffy sleeve, but I decided not to. I decided I was going to rip it back and do the decreases. So, it's obviously up to you where your your threshold is of this needs to be ripped back and actually I'm just going to let it lie. But I'm just saying having mistakes in your knitting is very natural. It's very natural. It's just part of the game. It really doesn't matter that much. I think knitting attracts a lot of perfectionists, and sometimes their opinions are quite loud. And for those of us who are a little bit slapdash, it can certainly make you feel a bit judged and less than, because you're sort of like, oh, well, I don't really care. There's a mistake. I'm just going to carry on. But that's what I do. And I would say that's absolutely fine to do. And I actually think I enjoy my projects a lot more, and I'm a lot more motivated when I have that attitude of being like, oh, well, whatever, let's just carry on and let's like get to the end of it, rather than being really anal about like, oh, well, I made a mistake like 6 rows again, so I've got to go and rip back to my lifeline and la 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 la, like just could never be me. So I hope this video was interesting to you. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree. I am expecting a lot of people to disagree with me. And I want to reiterate again, I'm not saying you shouldn't use lifelines, you shouldn't do color dominance, you shouldn't la la la. Absolutely do you, but I just think if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by it, know that these are extras. I consider them to be extras. I don't think that you really need to worry about it. You could go your whole knitting life, as I do, and not worry about these things. So I hope you take some comfort from that. Or you just think that I'm a super messy knitter and you would never take advice from me. And that's fine as well. We're all our own people. So before I go, I just wanted to give a little shout out to Lumos on Lumos. So this company really kindly reached out to me and offered to send me one of their knitting lights. I just want to tell you a little bit about it. So this is the Lumos and Lumos knitting light. It is just a light that goes around your neck. It's got a little flexible wire there. So it's got these 2 lights at the end. And the function of this is that obviously when you're doing your knitting, you just put the lights, point it towards your knitting, and then you can knit away. And it's really, really good. I don't know obviously where you live, but where I live, we're in winter at the moment, and when it gets to about 5 p.m, the lights go way down. It's really difficult to see. So this is a great little boost of light for your knitting or craft. You could use crochet. My mum has also got one to use for her sewing, and it's really, really useful. So it just allows you to craft without straining your eyes or holding your knitting like right up here. Thank you again to Lumos on Lumos. And thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you soon.